Now, more stories, insights, and analysis of Illinois policy and politics. This is Illinois Rising, presented by the Illinois Policy Institute. Once again, your host, AM 560's Dan Proft.
Dan Proft back with Pat Hughes, and Pat, Tiny Dancer this week filed suit against the federal government for the threat that has been made by the Department of Justice to withhold grant funding to the city of Chicago for being a sanctuary city. Saying that Tiny Dancer saying, of course, that does not comport with Chicago values. A alert listener this week texted in this conundrum: what if the person here illegally works at Chick-fil-A? Now, so you think you have Chicago values running into conflict with one another. How would Tiny Dancer resolve that problem?
I don't think he would.
Yeah. So the likelihood of success for this seems remote. The political pandering quotient seems very high. But for more on the topic, since we've got a couple hundred sanctuary cities around the country, you may have some people piggybacking on Chicago if Emanuel was able to move this anywhere. We're pleased to be joined by Tom Rogan, columnist at the Washington Examiner, panelist on the McLaughlin Group, and senior fellow at the Steamboat Institute, who recently wrote a compelling piece on this topic: Trump is right to confront Rahm Emanuel's sanctuary city. Tom, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Good to be with you.
Why is Trump right to confront Tiny Dancer, as we term him here?
Well, I think the focal point is that if you consider the law, that the federal government has supremacy in terms of enforcing the sovereignty of the nation, which obviously would entail immigration. This is a very small step in terms of the ability to give fruition to that belief, in federal supremacy, but also taxpayer accountability at the federal level, that money is not spent in a way that is incongruent with the demands of the federal government. So it's a basic, I think, principle.
So, Tom, obviously you're referring to the supremacy clause of the Constitution, where the federal law, of course, supersedes the state or city government law. It's sort of how this works in our system. But I have a suspicion that Emanuel winning or losing the lawsuit isn't really what he's trying to accomplish here. What he's trying to accomplish is, number one, he wants to virtue signal to people on the left who love this kind of stuff. We're also welcoming and everything else. And to number two, the vast array of Hispanic voters in the city and otherwise, to signal to them that Rahm is on their side, and anyone who would oppose a sanctuary city is really, opposed to Mexican Americans, et cetera.
Yeah, and I mean, the simple fact here is that the issue we face is one of a mayor refusing to follow the law in terms of the federal government's responsibility, both moral and legal, to enforce the law. So, I mean, it is. I just don't buy that argument. I mean, if we have people in the country who are illegal immigrants and there has been a federal finding to remove them, to deport them, it is incumbent upon him to facilitate that. If he doesn't want to do it, again, this is a very mild step. It's a qualification of a federal grant. He's not, and what it also speaks to here, that his reticence about this is that I think the left's expectation that federal grants should be without any strings attached, that it's an entitlement that they deserve. And we see this, of course, whether it be Medicaid, Medicare, whatever it might be. But in this case, he wants something for nothing, and he's not entitled to it. And I think Trump is right to say, fine, let's just go. We'll go to the Supreme Court if we have to, and you're going to lose.
If the purse strings are not enough to incentivize compliance with federal law for politicians like Rahm Emanuel, is there the possibility that Congress could take up more dramatic action to essentially provide the opportunity to pierce sovereign immunity for politicians like Rahm Emanuel and actually prosecute them for violating federal law?
Well, that would be obviously a much more aggressive step. I don't know if that's something they would be considering. Personally, I would think that, it should be. I mean, it should be considered because ultimately, again, he is not. He is obstructing the application of federal law, right? So ultimately, we have to address this issue one way or another. I suspect that as the Trump administration ramps up into different areas, for example, into federal education grants or investment grants, whatever it might be, as well as this particular police grant, then the impact that will have on city finances will be significant enough that there will be a change in behavior. And frankly, I think another important point here is that regardless of the opinion in particular cities, the American people are broadly sympathetic.
And
idea of backing down sanctuary cities.
Yeah, so what was your reaction to the Miami-Dade mayor reversing course with their sanctuary city designation and playing ball to get the federal funding, and his explanation, despite the fact that he's a subject of protests from the left on the topic?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that proves the point, doesn't it? That he is, making a determination that the interests of his citizens are far best served in terms of making sure that money is retained, and if that doesn't happen, then the suffering is far greater by the loss of that fund than by the act to fulfill what the federal government wants to do. And I think, again, it's a simple zero-sum game at that crunch point. The key is for the Trump administration to make sure that it's understood as the crunch point, to make it that crunch point.
Yeah, acting in the best interest of your constituents is not something we're terribly familiar with here, so I guess that was why we're a bit confused at what happened in Miami-Dade. He's Tom Rogan, columnist at the Washington Examiner, panelist on the McLaughlin Group, senior fellow at the Steamboat Institute. Tom, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
No problem. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.